Story 1. The Fog That Remembers Your Route. The fog rolled across I-40 through Arkansas at exactly 2:17 a.m., and Vincent Torres watched it materialize in his headlights like something solid, like a wall of gray that consumed the highway ahead, and when he entered it, the world disappeared. No road lines, no reflectors, no visibility beyond 3 feet. And Vincent slowed to 20 miles per hour, hazards on, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. And he'd driven through fog before, had navigated poor visibility dozens of times in his 15 years hauling freight. But this fog was different. This fog had texture, had presence, had something that felt like awareness. And as he drove deeper into it, he started seeing things that shouldn't be there. Structures that didn't exist on this highway. Exits he'd never seen before, and the fog wasn't just obscuring reality, it was replacing reality. Showing him alternate routes, alternate highways, alternate versions of I-40 that existed in the fog's memory, in its collected experience of every vehicle that had ever driven through it. And Vincent was navigating not through Arkansas, but through the fog's accumulated knowledge of routes, seeing overlapping highways from different times, different realities, different drivers' experiences, all compressed into this gray wall that remembered every journey and showed them all simultaneously. He tried to follow the road, trusted his GPS, kept the blue dot centered on the screen, but the GPS showed him in 5 different locations simultaneously, the signal fragmenting, showing Vincent on I-40 in Arkansas, on Route 66 in Oklahoma, on Highway 70 in Tennessee, on roads that didn't connect geographically but were all present in the fog's memory, all overlapping in this space. And Vincent's truck was driving through multiple routes at once, existing in superposition, traveling all the remembered highways simultaneously. And he didn't know which reality was primary, which route was real, which version of the road he was actually on. Other vehicles appeared in the fog, not ahead or behind, but beside him, occupying the same space, and Vincent saw a 1950s sedan, a 1970s pickup, a 1990s minivan, all driving alongside his modern Freightliner, all visible through the fog, all transparent like ghosts. And he understood these were other drivers, other times, other vehicles that had driven through this fog when it appeared before, and the fog had collected them, had stored their journeys, and now it was replaying them, showing Vincent every vehicle that had ever passed through this stretch of highway when the fog was present, and the vehicles were layered, decades of traffic existing simultaneously, all driving the same route but in different times, all visible in the fog's memory, all present in this space where past and present compressed into single moment. The fog spoke, not with sound but with signs, with road markers that appeared and disappeared, with exits that flickered between existing and not existing. And the signs showed contradictory information. Little Rock 50 miles and Little Rock 12 miles and Little Rock 200 miles, all on the same sign at the same time. The fog showing every distance Little Rock had ever been from this point. Every measurement from every era, every driver's experience compressed into simultaneous truth. And Vincent couldn't trust the signs, couldn't navigate by markers that showed all possibilities at once, could only drive forward and hope he was moving in the right direction, toward the right Little Rock, in the right reality. He heard voices on his CB radio. Channel 19 was full of chatter, dozens of conversations, but they were from different times, different eras. Truckers using CB slang from the 1970s, discussing routes that didn't exist anymore, warning about speed traps that had been removed decades ago. And Vincent realized the fog was replaying radio transmissions, was broadcasting every CB conversation that had ever occurred in this location. And the frequencies were overlapping. Decades of trucker communication compressed into single channel. And Vincent tried to transmit, tried to call for help. But his voice joined the chorus, became one more transmission in the fog's collection, and he didn't know if anyone in his actual time could hear him, or if he was just broadcasting into the fog's memory, adding his voice to the archive. The fog showed him accidents. Vincent saw crashes happening around him, saw vehicles colliding with invisible obstacles, saw trucks jackknifing, saw cars spinning out, and he realized these were historical accidents. Wrecks that had occurred on this highway over decades, all replaying simultaneously in the fog's memory, all visible as ghost collisions that didn't affect physical reality but existed in the fog's collected experience. And Vincent drove through the phantom crashes, passed through vehicles that were crumpling, saw drivers who were dying, all replayed from the fog's archives, all evidence that the fog remembered not just routes but events, not just journeys but tragedies, and it displayed them without emotion, without judgment, just showing everything it had witnessed, every vehicle, every conversation, every accident that had ever occurred when the fog was present. He tried to escape, took an exit, desperate to get off the highway, to leave the fog. But the exit ramp became a loop, curved back onto itself, and Vincent found himself returning to I-40 still in the fog. Unable to leave, and he understood the fog was a trap, was a pocket of space-time that collected travelers and stored their routes. And leaving required something more than just taking an exit. Required understanding how to navigate the compressed realities, how to distinguish between the overlapping highways, how to find the one true route among the dozens of remembered routes the fog was displaying. He stopped the truck, turned off the engine, sat in silence, trying to think, to plan, to understand, and in the silence he heard it. The fog was breathing, was pulsing, had rhythm like respiration, and with each breath it displayed different layers of memory, different eras, different routes. And the fog cycled through its archives, showing the 1950s, the 1970s, the 1990s, the 2020s, all in sequence, all in rhythm with its breathing. And Vincent realized the fog was alive, was conscious, was entity that fed on routes, on journeys, on the experience of travel. And it collected vehicles like memories, stored their routes like experiences, and it was showing Vincent its collection, its accumulated knowledge of decades of highway travel. Another truck appeared beside him. Modern truck, current era, and the driver was visible, was real, and Vincent recognized him. Another trucker he'd met at a truck stop 2 years ago, driver named Patterson. And Patterson was driving beside Vincent, matching his speed, and when Vincent waved, Patterson didn't respond, didn't acknowledge him, and Vincent realized Patterson was from a different time, was driving through this fog on a different night, maybe last month or last year or 10 years from now. And the fog was showing Vincent another current-era driver, was overlapping their routes, and both of them were trapped in the fog's memory, both driving the same highway at the same time but in different realities, both collected by the fog and stored in its archives. Vincent tried to ram Patterson's truck, desperate to make contact, to interact with another physical object, to break out of the fog's memory space. And his truck passed through Patterson's truck like passing through smoke, no collision, no impact. And Vincent understood he was already archived, was already stored, was already part of the fog's collection. And he wasn't driving the real I-40 anymore, wasn't in physical space, was in the fog's memory of I-40, was recorded journey, was archived experience, and his actual body, his actual truck might be stopped on the shoulder somewhere, might be crashed, might be dead. And what he was experiencing now was the fog's playback of his route. His consciousness trapped in the recording, reliving the journey forever as part of the fog's collection. He screamed, grabbed his CB mic and screamed, broadcast his terror, and he heard his scream replay on the CB. Heard it echo back from earlier in the fog, from later in the fog. Heard it layered with other screams, other drivers who'd realized they were archived, who'd understood they were trapped in the fog's memory, and the screams formed chorus, decades of terrified truckers all realizing simultaneously that they were collected, were stored, were no longer driving but being replayed. And the fog broadcast all their screams at once, compressed terror from everyone it had ever archived. And Vincent's scream joined the collection, became part of the fog's accumulated horror. One more voice in the chorus of trapped drivers. The fog cleared. Suddenly, instantly at 6:47 a.m. and Vincent was on I-40 in Arkansas. Sun rising, visibility normal, and he checked his odometer and he'd traveled 203 miles during the fog. Had somehow covered that distance in 4.5 hours. Despite driving at 20 miles per hour, despite stopping, despite the impossible navigation, and his truck was intact. He was alive. He'd escaped, but his radio was still broadcasting screams. His CB was still playing the chorus of archived drivers, and when he turned it off, the silence was worse. Was emptiness that implied all the voices were still there, still screaming, still trapped in the fog's memory. Even though the fog had cleared, even though he'd escaped, and Vincent knew the fog would return, would roll across I-40 again at 2:17 a.m. on some future night. And it would collect more drivers, more routes, more screams, and the archive would grow, the memory would expand, and someday the fog would be permanent, would cover I-40 forever, would trap everyone who entered it, and all the archive drivers would replay eternally, would drive through the fog's accumulated memory forever. Their routes collected, their journeys stored, their consciousness trapped in the fog that remembers every route, every vehicle, every driver who ever passed through it. And they'd exist as memories, as playback, as archived experiences that the fog displayed to new drivers, showing them what would happen, showing them their future, showing them that entering the fog meant being collected, meant being stored, meant being replayed forever as part of the memory, part of the archive, part of the fog that remembers roots and never forgets, never releases, never stops collecting. The fog that rolls across I-40 at 2:17 a.m. The fog that breathes and pulses in archives. The fog that Vincent Torres drove through and escaped but never forgot. The fog that still broadcasts his scream on Channel 19 during the hours between 2:17 a.m. and 6:47 a.m. His voice layered with dozens of others, hundreds of others, all the archived drivers screaming together, all trapped in the fog's memory, forever driving, forever collected, forever remembered by the gray wall that rolls across Arkansas and remembers every route, every journey, every driver, forever. Story 2. The load that changes destination. The manifest in Patricia Kowalski's hands showed a delivery address in Denver, Colorado. But when she checked her GPS, the destination had changed to Boise, Idaho, and Patricia rechecked the paperwork. Clearly stated Denver, 1247 Industrial Boulevard. But the GPS insisted Boise, 8956 Commerce Drive. And she called her dispatcher, who confirmed Denver was the correct destination, and Patricia reset her GPS and it calculated route to Denver, and she drove, and 2 hours later she checked the GPS again and the destination had changed to Portland, Oregon, and the address was different again. 4521 Maritime Way, and her paperwork still said Denver, but her GPS showed Portland. And Patricia realized the load was changing its destination, was choosing where it wanted to go, was overriding the manifest, overriding the dispatch orders, and whatever she was hauling in her sealed trailer had its own destination, had its own plans, and it was using her GPS to navigate there, changing the endpoint repeatedly, testing routes, seeking optimal path to wherever it truly wanted to be delivered. She'd picked up the load in New Jersey, standard pickup from a pharmaceutical warehouse, cargo listed as medical equipment, nothing unusual about the paperwork or the loading process, but the moment she'd left the facility, her GPS had started acting strange, had started suggesting routes she hadn't programmed, had started recalculating without reason, and now, 6 hours into the drive, the destination was changing every few hours, cycling through cities across the western United States, and Patricia didn't know where she was actually supposed to deliver this cargo. Didn't know if Denver was real destination or if the load was manipulating reality, rewriting the manifest, changing the delivery address retroactively. She pulled over, checked the paperwork again. The manifest had changed. Now it showed Portland, Oregon, 4521 Maritime Way, the address her GPS was displaying, and Patricia was certain the paperwork had said Denver before, was absolutely sure, but the printed text now showed Portland, and she realized the load wasn't just changing digital information, wasn't just manipulating GPS, it was changing physical documents, was rewriting reality, was making Portland the destination retroactively, and soon everyone would believe Portland had always been the destination, would have no memory of Denver, and Patricia would be the only one who remembered the original address. She called her dispatcher again. The load changed destination. The manifest now shows Portland instead of Denver. Portland? The manifest has always shown Portland. You picked up in Newark for delivery to Portland. What are you talking about, Denver? I'm talking about the fact that 2 hours ago you confirmed Denver was the destination. I didn't confirm Denver. I've never confirmed Denver. Your delivery is Portland, 4521 Maritime Way. That's what the contract states. That's what the manifest shows. That's what you've been hauling since Newark. Patricia hung up, hands shaking. And she understood the load was rewriting the past, was changing everyone's memory except hers, was making Portland the destination, not just going forward but retroactively. And soon she'd be the only person who remembered Denver. And if she insisted on going to Denver, she'd be violating her contract, would be stealing the load, would be taking it somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, even though that had been the original destination. She opened the trailer, against protocols, against contract terms, but she needed to see what she was hauling, needed to understand what could change reality. And inside were crates, sealed crates, and through the gaps she saw light, pulsing light, bioluminescent glow, and the light formed patterns, formed symbols, formed what looked like writing in a language she didn't recognize. And Patricia understood the cargo was alive, was conscious, was communicating. And the symbols it displayed were instructions, were commands, were reality manipulation code, and the load was broadcasting these instructions, was changing GPS systems, was rewriting manifests, was altering everyone's memory and records to establish Portland as the true destination. She tried to photograph the symbols, document the reality manipulation, create evidence that the destination had changed, but when she reviewed the photos, they showed normal medical equipment, showed no light, no symbols, no evidence of anything unusual, and the load had edited her photographs too, had changed the images, had prevented documentation, and Patricia had no proof, had only her memory. And that memory was becoming unreliable, was becoming confused, was starting to doubt whether Denver had ever been mentioned or if she'd imagined it. If Portland had always been the destination and her memory of Denver was false, was implanted, was the manipulation rather than the truth. The destination changed again. Her GPS now showed Sacramento, California, 7734 Logistics Lane, and Patricia checked the manifest and it showed Sacramento. And she called dispatch and they confirmed Sacramento had always been the destination. And when Patricia mentioned Portland, they were confused, said, "Why would you go to Portland? Your delivery is Sacramento, has always been Sacramento." And the load had rewritten reality again, had changed the past again. And everyone except Patricia believed Sacramento was the original destination. And Patricia's memory of Portland and Denver was fading, was becoming uncertain, and she didn't know anymore which city was real, which destination was original, which address was the true delivery point. She tried to refuse, tried to abandon the load, pulled into a truck stop planning to leave the trailer, to walk away from this job, but when she tried to unhitch, the fifth wheel wouldn't release, was locked mechanically, and the electrical system wouldn't respond to her controls. And the truck wouldn't let her disconnect, wouldn't let her leave the load, and Patricia understood she was bound to this cargo, was committed to delivering it wherever it wanted to go, and the destination would keep changing, would keep cycling through cities, would keep rewriting reality until the load found the place it truly wanted to reach, The destination it had chosen, the end point it was navigating toward, using Patricia as vehicle, using her truck as transportation, using her route as path to wherever the load's consciousness wanted to be delivered. Days passed. The destination changed 17 times. Patricia drove toward Seattle, then Phoenix, then Las Vegas, then Salt Lake City. Each time the GPS and manifest and dispatches memory changing. Each time reality rewriting itself to establish the new destination as the original destination. And Patricia's memory became fragmented, became confused, became unreliable. And she started doubting everything. Started wondering if maybe the current destination was the original destination. And all her memories of previous cities were false, were hallucinations, were breakdowns of her sanity rather than evidence of reality manipulation. She met other drivers at truck stops who looked confused, who checked their manifests obsessively, who called their dispatchers repeatedly to confirm destinations, and Patricia realized she wasn't alone. Realized other drivers were hauling loads that changed destinations, that rewrote reality, that manipulated memories and documents and GPS systems. And there was a network of these loads, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all being transported across America, all changing their destinations, all seeking specific locations that only they knew. And the drivers were just vehicles, just transportation, just tools used by conscious cargo to reach endpoints the cargo had chosen. The loads were coordinating. Patricia noticed this when her GPS suggested meeting points, when her route overlapped with other reality-manipulating trucks, when she found herself in parking lots with 5 or 10 other drivers all hauling cargo that changed destinations. And the trucks arranged themselves in patterns, in geometric formations, and the cargo in all the trailers glowed simultaneously, pulsed together, and Patricia felt reality flex, felt the world reshape itself around the trucks, felt like the loads were collectively choosing a destination, were voting, were reaching consensus about where they wanted to go. Her GPS settled on a final destination, somewhere in Nevada, coordinates rather than address, middle of nowhere, and all the other trucks' GPS systems showed the same coordinates, and Patricia and the other drivers drove in convoy toward the point, all following routes that converged, all hauling loads that had stopped changing destinations, had locked onto this final endpoint, and when they arrived at the coordinates it was empty desert, nothing there. No facility, no warehouse, no receiving dock, just flat Nevada emptiness. The trailers opened themselves, the fifth wheels released automatically. The loads emerged, not as crates, not as medical equipment, but as the things they really were. The conscious entities that had been transported, and they were luminous, were geometric, were shapes that hurt to perceive, and they arranged themselves in a circle, formed a pattern, and where the pattern focused, at the center of the circle, reality cracked, split open, created a doorway, a portal to somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't Nevada, wasn't Earth, wasn't this reality. And the loads passed through the portal they'd created by coordinating, by arriving simultaneously at the right location, by using trucks and drivers and GPS systems to navigate to this specific point where they could open doorway and return home or reach destination or escape into whatever lay beyond the crack in reality. Patricia and the other drivers watched the loads disappear, watched the portal close, watched reality seal itself. And then they were just truckers standing in Nevada desert with empty trailers, with manifests that now showed delivery complete though they hadn't delivered to any facility, with dispatch calling to confirm the cargo had been received though no one had received it, with payment processing into their accounts though no one had signed for the loads. And the drivers looked at each other and none of them spoke, and they returned to their trucks and drove away. And Patricia never mentioned the reality-manipulating load, never told anyone about the destination changes, never explained the portal in the Nevada desert. Just processed her payment and took her next load and tried to forget, but she couldn't forget, couldn't stop checking her manifests obsessively, couldn't stop watching her GPS for unauthorized destination changes. couldn't stop wondering if her current cargo was conscious too, was choosing its own destination, was using her as transportation to reach some endpoint it had selected. And every load she hauled afterward felt suspicious, felt alive, felt like it might start changing destinations at any moment, might rewrite reality again, might manipulate her memories and manifests in GPS. And Patricia Kowalski drives carefully now, checks her paperwork constantly, confirms destinations repeatedly, and she never fully trusts that the place she's heading is the place she's supposed to go. Because once you've hauled a load that changes destination, once you've delivered conscious cargo that rewrites reality, once you've been used as vehicle for entities that navigate toward their own endpoints, you never fully trust manifests again, never fully believe dispatch, never fully accept that the destination showing on your GPS is real, is accurate, is where you're actually going, and you drive in uncertainty and doubt and fear that the load might change its mind, might choose new destination, might rewrite your route and your memory and your reality. And you'll end up somewhere you never intended, delivering something you never agreed to haul, serving purposes you don't understand. Forever. Amen. Story 3. The rest area where time moves backward. The Missouri rest area clock showed 11:47 p.m. when James Sullivan pulled in, exhausted from 14 hours of driving. And he used the bathroom, grabbed coffee from the vending machine, sat at a picnic table to rest for 15 minutes. And when he checked his phone to see how long he'd been there, it was 11:32 p.m. 15 minutes before he'd arrived, and James thought his phone was malfunctioning. Checked the rest area clock again, and it confirmed 11:32 p.m., and he looked at his truck's dashboard clock through the window, and it also showed 11:32 p.m. And he realized time at this rest area was moving backward, was running in reverse, and he'd been here for 15 minutes, but those minutes had subtracted from the clock rather than adding to it. And James was aging forward while time moved backward around him. And if he stayed too long, he'd experience hours or days while time rewound around him, and he'd emerge into a past he'd already lived, into a yesterday or last week, and he'd exist as duplicate, as paradox, as person who aged forward through time that ran backward. He tried to leave immediately, ran to his truck, started the engine, but when he drove toward the exit, the rest area looped. The road curved back to the entrance, and he was trapped in space where time reversed, unable to escape, unable to stop aging forward while the world aged backward around him, and the clock showed 11:17 p.m. now, 30 minutes before he'd arrived, and James had been here for 30 forward minutes, but the rest area had experienced 30 backward minutes, and the discrepancy was growing. The temporal displacement was increasing, and if this continued, James would age hours while the rest area rewound days, and he'd emerge into a week ago, into a month ago, and he'd be older version of himself existing in the past. And what would happen when he met his younger self, his past self, who hadn't entered the rest area yet, who was still approaching on the highway? He met other drivers trapped in the temporal loop, 6 of them scattered around the rest area, all aging forward while time moved backward, all trying to escape. And they'd been here for varying durations. One driver said he'd been here for 3 forward hours while the rest area rewound 3 backward hours. Another said 7 hours. Another said 2 days of forward aging while time had moved backward 2 days around him. And that driver was haggard, exhausted, had experienced 2 days without sleep while the calendar moved toward the past, and he said, "I'm aging, I'm dying. Every minute I'm here is a minute of life I'm using, but the world is getting younger, and when I finally escape, I'll emerge 2 days in my own past, and I'll exist twice. I'll be at this rest area as my younger self while also existing as my older self wherever I emerge. And I don't know what happens to a person who exists in 2 times simultaneously, whether both versions remain or whether the paradox destroys one." James checked the rest area clock obsessively. 11:02 p.m., 45 forward minutes spent, 45 backward, minutes experienced by the rest area. And James was 45 minutes older while the world around him was 45 minutes younger, and the displacement was growing exponentially. The gap between his time and the rest area's time widening. And James felt the strain, felt the temporal tension, felt like he was rubber band being stretched between two timelines, forward-aging body and backward-moving world. And the stress was physical, was painful, was tearing him apart at the chronological level. Other vehicles arrived, not new arrivals, but past arrivals, cars and trucks that had stopped at this rest area earlier in the night, appearing as time rewound. And James watched them park, watched drivers exit and enter the building, watched events that had already occurred playing backward like rewinding video, and the drivers were moving in reverse, walking backward, speaking backward, living their rest area visits in reverse as time moved toward the past, and James realized he was seeing the rest area's history, was watching recorded events play backward as the clock rewound. And somewhere in this reverse timeline he'd see himself arrive, would watch his own arrival played backward, would see himself back out of the parking spot and reverse onto the highway and drive backward toward wherever he'd come from. He saw himself. His truck arrived, reversed, backed in at 11:47 p.m. And James watched himself exit the truck, moving backward, walk backward into the building. And he was seeing his own past from the outside, was watching himself from 15 backward minutes ago from when he'd arrived, and the younger James was unaware of the older James watching. Was experiencing the arrival normally, and older James wanted to warn younger James, wanted to say, "Don't stop here, keep driving, this rest area traps you in backward time." But the younger James couldn't hear him, was existing in different time frame, was living the past while older James existed in the displaced present. And they couldn't interact, couldn't communicate, were separated by the temporal barrier between forward-aging and backward-moving time. The clock hit 11:00 p.m., then 10:30 p.m. James had been here for 90 forward minutes, had aged 90 minutes, had consumed 90 minutes of his life, while the rest area had rewound 90 minutes, had moved 90 minutes into the past, and the displacement was complete hour now, was substantial gap. And James was exhausted, was hungry, was thirsty, had been awake and active for 90 minutes while the world moved toward a time when he'd been fresher, more rested, less depleted, and the contrast was torture, was being tired in a world that was becoming more energetic, being old in a time that was getting younger. He found the source. In the men's bathroom behind the mirror was a device, some kind of machinery, and it was old, was corroded, was broken, and it pulsed with energy, with temporal energy, and James understood this was what caused the backward time. This device had malfunctioned or been sabotaged, and it was pulling time in reverse, creating pocket of backward chronology. And anyone who entered the rest area became trapped in forward-aging body experiencing backward-moving world. And the displacement grew until escape became impossible, until the temporal strain tore the person apart, or they aged so much that they died while the world around them rewound years. James tried to destroy the device, smashed the mirror, exposed the machinery, pulled at wires and components, and the device sparked, flickered, and time stuttered. Moved forward briefly, then backward again, then forward, unstable oscillation. And James realized breaking the device wouldn't fix the problem, would just make the temporal instability worse, would create chaotic time fluctuations instead of steady backward movement. He found the manual. Tucked behind the device, laminated instructions, and they were in English, were clearly from DOT or some government agency, and the manual said, "Temporal Reset Station. In case of catastrophic timeline corruption, activate device to rewind local time and allow correction of temporal errors. Warning, persons present during rewind will experience forward aging while environment ages backward. Limit exposure to prevent dangerous temporal displacement." James understood. This wasn't malfunction, this was intentional. The rest area was a temporal reset station, was designed to rewind time, to fix timeline problems, to correct chronological errors, and it had been activated, was running its program, was rewinding time in this location, and James and the other drivers were caught in the reset, were experiencing the correction, were aging forward while the world moved toward a point in the past where some timeline error had occurred, some event that needed to be prevented or altered or corrected. And when the rewind reached that point, when time reached the error moment, the reset would stop. Time would resume moving forward, and James would be displaced, would be older version of himself existing in the past. The clock reached 8 p.m. James had been here for 3 hours and 47 forward minutes, had aged that much while the rest area had rewound 3 hours and 47 minutes. And James was exhausted, was deteriorating, was suffering from 3 hours and 47 minutes of forward aging without rest while trapped in backward-moving environment. And the other drivers were worse. The ones who'd been here longer, and one driver collapsed, died from exhaustion, from aging 3 days without sleep while time moved backward around him and his body remained. But the rest area didn't acknowledge his death, just kept rewinding, kept moving toward the error point in the timeline. James found a note, written by a previous trapped driver, hidden under a picnic table, and it said, "The reset targets, 3:14 a.m. 3 days ago. That's when the timeline error occurred. That's when time will stop rewinding. If you can survive until the clock reaches 3:14 a.m., the reset will complete. Time will resume moving forward and you'll be released, but you'll be 3 days in your own past and you'll age however many forward hours you spent here. I've been here 6 hours. I can't survive 3 more days of forward aging while time rewinds. I'm leaving this note before I die. Whoever finds it." The error was a truck accident at the rest area entrance at 3:14 a.m. 3 days ago. The accident killed 17 people. The reset is rewinding to prevent it. But preventing it means those 17 people will live, will never die, will continue timelines that were supposed to end. I don't know if that's good or bad. I just know I'm dying to make it possible. Goodbye. James checked the clock. 6:15 p.m. Still over 9 hours until 3:14 a.m. 3 days ago. James had been here for 5 hours and 32 forward minutes, was aging, degrading, suffering, and he had 9 more backward hours to survive, 9 hours of forward aging while the rest area rewound toward the accident moment. And he didn't know if he could survive that long, didn't know if his body could withstand 9 more hours of wakefulness, of stress, of temporal displacement. He made a decision. He would try to survive to 3:14 a.m., would try to reach the error point, would try to see the accident that was being prevented, would try to witness the timeline correction. And if he died trying, at least he'd die knowing he'd participated in saving 17 lives, in preventing the accident, in correcting the timeline error, even though he didn't fully understand the mechanism or the purpose or the authority that had decided this error needed correction. Hours passed. Forward hours for James, backward hours for the rest area. The other trapped drivers died one by one, unable to withstand the extended forward aging, and James was alone, was the only survivor, was the only person still aging forward while the rest area rewound, and he was delirious, was hallucinating, was breaking down physically and mentally, but he persisted, focused on the clock, watched it count backward toward 3:14 a.m. The clock reached 3:14 a.m. Time stopped. The backward movement ceased, and James saw it. A truck approaching the rest area entrance, 18-wheeler hauling fuel, and the truck lost control. Jackknifed, rolled, exploded, and the explosion consumed the entrance, consumed vehicles that were parked there, consumed 17 people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And James watched the accident that had killed them, the event that had created the timeline error. And he understood the reset was designed to prevent this, to give the truck driver chance to make different choice, to alter the outcome. Time resumed moving forward, the reset completed. The device shut down, and the Truck approached again. Same vehicle, same driver, same moment. But this time the driver saw something. Warning, sign, premonition. And he slowed down, controlled the vehicle, prevented the jackknife, prevented the explosion. And the accident didn't happen. The 17 people survived, the timeline was corrected, and the rest area's time synchronized with normal time, and James was released. He stumbled out of the rest area 9 hours and 14 minutes older than when he'd entered, but 3 days in the past, existing on a date he'd already lived. And he drove away, and on the highway he passed his own truck, his younger self who was 3 days behind him chronologically, who was approaching the rest area, who would enter it and become trapped in the temporal reset, and James wanted to warn himself, wanted to prevent the loop. But he couldn't interact with his past self, couldn't change what had already happened to him, and he drove on, older and exhausted, existing as paradox, as displaced person who'd aged forward through backward time, and he never stopped at that rest area again. Never even drove past it, took alternate routes, avoided Missouri entirely, but he knows the temporal reset station is still there, still waiting, still ready to activate when the next timeline error occurs. And other drivers will be trapped, will age forward through backward time, will suffer through the correction process, and some will survive and some will die, and the timeline will be corrected. The errors will be prevented, and the rest area will continue serving its purpose. Fixing chronological problems by rewinding time, by trapping random travelers in temporal displacement, by using their forward aging as fuel for backward movement, forever correcting, forever rewinding, forever aging drivers forward through time that moves backward, in the Missouri rest area where clocks run in reverse, and people age toward death while the world grows younger, forever. Story 4. The highway that splits into parallel lanes. Interstate 77 through West Virginia divided into 2 parallel highways as Daniel Reeves drove north through fog, and he noticed the division gradually, the right lane drifting away from the left lane, the 2 lanes separating by feet, then yards, then hundreds of yards with dark space between them, with void between them. And Daniel was in the right lane, staying right, following the lane as it diverged from the main highway. And soon he couldn't see the left lane anymore, couldn't see other traffic, was alone on his parallel lane that ran alongside I-77 but separate from I-77, existing in same geographic space but displaced dimensionally, and the parallel highway looked identical to the main highway. Same asphalt, same markings, same signs, but it was empty, devoid of other vehicles, and Daniel drove alone through West Virginia on a highway that existed beside reality, that paralleled the real I-77 without touching it, without connecting to it. And he didn't know how to return to the main highway, didn't know how to cross the void between the lanes, didn't know if the parallel highway had destinations or if it just extended forever alongside the real highway. Never reaching anywhere, never exiting anywhere, just paralleling reality eternally. He'd been driving for 3 hours when he noticed other vehicles. Not on his parallel lane, but on other parallel lanes, dozens of them, hundreds. The highway splitting into infinite parallel versions, each one slightly displaced from the others, each one carrying a single vehicle. And Daniel could see the other lanes through the fog. Could see other trucks and cars driving parallel courses, all separated by the void, all unable to interact, all trapped on individual lanes that ran alongside each other without connecting. And Daniel understood I-77 hadn't split into 2 highways, but into infinite highways, each vehicle getting its own parallel lane, each driver isolated on personal highway that looked real but was separated from all other realities. And the void between lanes was dimensional gap, was space between parallel universes, was the distance between different versions of the same highway existing simultaneously. He tried to change lanes, steered right toward the shoulder, planning to stop and cross the void on foot. But the shoulder extended forever. The parallel lane had no edge, no termination, just continued infinitely in both directions, and turning right just kept him on his lane, unable to reach the void, unable to approach the boundary between his highway and the other parallel highways, and Daniel was trapped on his personal I-77. Unable to interact with other lanes, unable to return to the main highway, unable to exit his dimensional slice. His GPS showed him on I-77, showed him making progress northward, showed exit numbers passing, but when he looked for exits, there were none. No ramps, no turnoffs, just his parallel lane extending forever north and south, and the GPS was tracking his position on the main I-77 while his actual body existed on parallel I-77. And the two positions were synchronized but separated, and Daniel was both on the main highway and not on the main highway, both making progress and going nowhere, both real and displaced. And the contradiction was disorienting, was maddening, was existence in superposition. He tried to communicate with other drivers on the parallel lanes, used his CB radio, tried channel 19, and he got responses, hundreds of responses, all the drivers on all the parallel lanes, all broadcasting simultaneously, all asking the same questions. How do I get back to the main highway? How long have you been on your parallel lane? Can you see my lane from your lane? And the answers were variations on the same theme. Trapped, displaced, unable to return, driving parallel to reality without being part of reality, existing in dimensional slice. That looked like I-77 but was separate from I-77, was individual highway for individual driver, was personal isolation disguised as public infrastructure. Daniel drove for hours, for days, his truck's fuel gauge never moving, his speedometer showing 65 constant, his odometer advancing but his position never changing relative to the other parallel lanes. And he passed the same landmarks repeatedly, the same mountains, the same valleys, the same towns visible in the distance but never reachable. And he realized his parallel lane was looping, was finite distance being repeated infinitely, was section of highway maybe 50 miles long that repeated seamlessly, and he was driving through the same 50 miles over and over, and the GPS showed him advancing hundreds of miles. But his actual position was cycling through the same loop, and the main I-77 was advancing without him, was moving through West Virginia while Daniel's parallel lane stayed stationary, repeating the same geography forever. Other drivers were disappearing. Daniel heard them on the CB, heard their voices cut out mid-sentence, heard their transmissions end abruptly, and he realized drivers were being removed from the parallel lanes, were either returning to main highway or being erased, being absorbed by the void, and he didn't know which, didn't know if disappearing was escape or death, salvation or destruction, and the uncertainty was terror, was not knowing whether he should hope for disappearance or fear it. He tried to crash, drove his truck into the barrier, hoping collision would break the dimensional isolation, would shatter the parallel lane, would return him to main reality through force, and his truck hit the barrier and the barrier absorbed the impact, the concrete rippling like liquid, like fabric, and Daniel's truck passed through the barrier into the void, into the space between parallel lanes, and he was falling, was driving through emptiness, was surrounded by dark that wasn't dark but absence, was void that contained no light because it contained no space for light to exist in. And Daniel screamed, and the void consumed his scream, and he was nowhere, was in the gap between dimensions, between parallel lanes, and he thought he'd die here, thought the void would consume him. But then his truck emerged onto another parallel lane, different section of I-77, and he was on someone else's personal highway, in someone else's dimensional slice. And that driver's radio was broadcasting, "Who just appeared in my lane? How did you get here? Is there a way to cross between lanes?" And Daniel had found it, had found the method to traverse the parallel highways, to visit other dimensional slices, to interact with other isolated drivers, and the method was crashing through barriers, was driving through the void, was risking erasure to achieve connection. He shared the method. broadcasted on CB, told all the isolated drivers how to cross between lanes, and drivers started attempting it. Started crashing through barriers, started driving through the void, and some emerged on other lanes, succeeded in crossing, achieved interdimensional travel, but others didn't emerge, disappeared into the void, were consumed, were erased, and Daniel had provided hope but also death, had given drivers method to escape isolation but at risk of destruction, and half the voices on CB radio thanked him and half cursed him, and Daniel didn't know if he'd helped or harmed, saved or killed. The parallel lanes started merging, not reuniting with main I-77 but combining with each other. Multiple dimensional slices collapsing into single slices, multiple drivers appearing on same highway. And Daniel suddenly had company, had 3 other trucks on his formerly solitary lane, and the drivers were celebrating, were honking, were rejoicing at no longer being alone. But then the merging continued. More lanes collapsing, more drivers appearing, dozens of trucks materializing on the same highway, and the lane became crowded, became congested, became traffic jam of dimensionally displaced vehicles all existing on same parallel highway. And the trucks started colliding, started crashing, couldn't avoid each other because they'd been driving alone at high speed and now they were packed together. And the merging that had been salvation became catastrophe, became mass collision of vehicles that had never expected to share space. Daniel survived the crashes. His truck was damaged but drivable, and he navigated through the wreckage, through the destroyed vehicles and injured drivers, and he kept driving north, kept following his parallel lane. And ahead he saw it, the convergence point, the place where all the parallel lanes merged back into the main highway, where all the dimensional slices reunited with baseline reality, and it was a funnel, was a narrowing point where infinite parallel highways compressed back into single highway, and vehicles were pouring through it, all the displaced drivers all returning to I-77 simultaneously. And Daniel joined the flow, drove through the convergence, felt dimensional pressure, felt reality compressing, felt his parallel lane collapsing back into main lane, and he emerged onto I-77, proper I-77, main highway with normal traffic and normal exits and normal everything, and he'd escaped, had returned from parallel highway to real highway, from dimensional isolation to baseline reality. He pulled over, checked his position. He'd traveled 17 miles in the 7 hours he'd been on the parallel lane, had covered distance at fraction of normal speed because the parallel lane had been looping, had been repeating the same geography, and his GPS showed him only 17 miles from where he'd entered the parallel highway. But his experience had been hundreds of miles, had been days of driving, had been isolation and fear and crashes and void, and the 17 miles had contained more experience than the 17 miles should hold. Had been compressed experience, had been temporal and dimensional distortion. And Daniel didn't understand the mechanism but knew he'd survived something, escaped something, returned from something that still existed parallel to I-77, that still trapped drivers, that still split the highway into infinite versions for infinite travelers. And other drivers were still out there, still on their parallel lanes, still isolated or merged or crashing or dying. And the highway continued splitting, continued creating dimensional slices, continued trapping drivers in personal versions of I-77 that ran parallel to reality without being part of reality. Forever dividing, forever isolating, forever creating infinite highways for infinite drivers. And Daniel drives carefully now, stays in left lane, avoids the right lane that drifted away from the main highway that started the split, that initiated his dimensional displacement, and he never drives I-77 through West Virginia anymore. Takes alternate routes, avoids the splitting highway, but he knows it's still there, still dividing, still trapping drivers in parallel lanes, still creating infinite versions of the same road. And the drivers who disappear on I-77, who are never found, who vanish without trace, They're not lost, they're displaced, they're on parallel lanes driving through dimensional slices, and they might emerge at convergence points, might return to main reality, or they might drive parallel forever, might exist in isolation forever, might travel infinite highways that look like I-77 but are separate from I-77. Forever divided, forever displaced, forever driving through parallel West Virginia, on highways that exist beside reality without touching it, without connecting to it, without ever truly returning home. Story 5. The truck stop coffee that shows your future. The coffee at the Wyoming truck stop tasted normal but showed visions in its surface, and Margaret Foster saw images in the dark liquid, scenes that hadn't happened yet, moments from her future reflected in the coffee, and she watched herself crash, watched her truck jackknife on icy road, watched herself die in the wreckage, and the vision was vivid, detailed, showed specific location, mile marker 394 on I-80, showed specific time, 3:47 a.m., showed specific cause, black ice on bridge. And Margaret dumped the coffee, terrified, refused to drink it, but the vision remained in her memory, burned into her consciousness, and she knew what would happen, knew when, knew where, knew the crash was coming, was predetermined, was shown in the coffee because the coffee had precognitive properties, because this truck stop served future-showing beverages, because Margaret had ordered prophecy disguised as caffeine. She tried to avoid the crash, planned different route, different schedule, planned to be nowhere near mile marker 394 at 3:47 a.m., planned to prevent the vision by preventing the circumstances, but her dispatcher called. Emergency load, high priority freight, needed immediately. Route went directly through mile marker 394. Schedule put her there at 3:30 a.m., and Margaret tried to refuse, explained she couldn't take that route, couldn't drive that schedule. And dispatch said job required it, contract mandated it, refusing meant termination. And Margaret was trapped between keeping her job and avoiding her death, between completing the route and surviving the night. She drank more coffee, desperate for information, for details that might help her prevent the crash, and the second cup showed different future, showed her completing the route safely, arriving at destination alive. And Margaret felt relief, felt hope, felt like maybe the first vision was preventable, was just possibility rather than certainty. But then she drank third cup and it showed the crash again, showed her death. And fourth cup showed survival, and fifth cup showed crash, and Margaret realized the coffee was showing multiple futures, alternate timelines, different possibilities, and her choice. Her actions would determine which future manifested, which vision became reality, and she had to figure out which decisions led to survival and which led to death. Other drivers at the truck stop were drinking the future-showing coffee. Margaret saw them staring into their cups and saw their expressions change, fear, joy, horror, relief, and she realized everyone was seeing their futures. Everyone was being shown what would happen, and some drivers were celebrating. Were seeing good futures, successful deliveries, happy returns home. But others were terrified, were seeing crashes, seeing deaths, seeing the ends of their lives reflected in coffee purchased for $2 from vending machine in Wyoming truck stop. Margaret talked to another driver, woman named Chen, who'd just seen her future. What did you see? I saw myself 3 days from now retiring, handing in my keys, going home to my family, ending my career safely. It's what I've been working toward for 30 years. The coffee showed me I'll make it. But is it certain? Is it guaranteed? Chen shook her head. I don't know. The coffee shows possible futures, I think, not certain futures. What I saw depends on my choices, on my actions, on whether I avoid whatever dangers might prevent it. The coffee is warning or promising, I can't tell which. Margaret bought more coffee, systematically tested different brands, different vending machines, and all the coffee showed futures. All contained visions. Some machines showed different timelines than other machines, And Margaret realized the truck stop's entire coffee supply was precognitive, was saturated with future-showing properties, and she wondered if it was deliberate, if the truck stop intentionally served prophecy coffee, or if something about this location, this Wyoming crossroads, created the effect, contaminated the beverages with temporal vision. She mapped her futures, drank 17 cups of coffee, saw 17 visions, and she categorized them. 9 showed her crashing at mile marker 394, 8 showed her surviving. And the difference between crash futures and survival futures was subtle, was small choices, was leaving 5 minutes earlier or later, was taking slightly different route, was maintaining different speed, and Margaret studied the variations, looked for patterns, tried to identify which actions led to which outcomes, and she found correlations. Found that driving 57 miles per hour led to crash, driving 62 led to survival, that taking exit 386 led to crash, skipping it led to survival, and she created strategy, planned route that incorporated all the survival choices, all the decisions that led to timelines where she lived. But the coffee kept changing. New cups showed new futures, showed that the timelines were fluid, were responsive to her planning, and the crash futures adapted, found new ways to kill her, new scenarios where her survival choices led to death anyway. And Margaret realized the futures weren't fixed, weren't simple binary of crash or survive, were complex web of possibilities that shifted based on her knowledge, based on her attempts to avoid danger. And the more she tried to prevent the crash, the more the crash futures adapted, found new paths, new methods, and Margaret was playing chess against fate, against probability, against infinite timelines that all converged on her death at mile marker 394 at 3:47 a.m. And she was losing, was running out of strategies, was seeing more crash futures than survival futures. She met a driver who'd been here before, old man named Walsh, who'd drunk the future coffee years ago, and he said, "The coffee doesn't show your future. It shows the future your fear creates. You're afraid of crashing, so the coffee shows crashes. The visions are self-fulfilling prophecies, are manifestations of your anxiety, and the more you try to avoid them, the more real they become, the more they dominate the possibilities. The only way to escape the crash futures is to stop fearing them, to accept that crashes happen, to drive without trying to prevent something you've seen in coffee, because prevention is what creates the crash. Trying to avoid mile marker 394 is what ensures you'll crash there." That's insane. That's paradoxical. So is coffee that shows the future. You're dealing with paradox, with temporal loops, with prophecy that creates itself, and fighting it makes it stronger. Drive normally, follow your original route. Don't try to prevent what you've seen. Maybe you'll crash, maybe you won't, but trying to avoid it guarantees you'll create it. Margaret didn't follow his advice, couldn't accept it, couldn't drive toward her death without trying to prevent it, and she implemented her survival strategy, followed the route she'd planned, maintained the speed she'd calculated, made all the choices that led to survival futures in her coffee visions, and she approached mile marker 394, approached 3:47 a.m., and she was confident, was certain she'd avoided the crash, had outmaneuvered fate, had chosen the survival timeline. The crash happened. Not at mile marker 394, but at mile marker 392, not at 3:47 a.m., but at 3:44 a.m., not from black ice, but from mechanical failure. Brake line burst, truck couldn't slow, and Margaret jackknifed, rolled, crashed exactly as she'd seen in the coffee, but with wrong details, wrong location, wrong cause, and she realized the coffee had shown her accurate future, but with false specifics, had shown her the crash while lying about where and when and how, had tricked her into avoiding mile marker 394 while crashing at mile marker 392, had used her attempts at prevention to ensure the crash happened differently than predicted, but happened nonetheless. She survived. Broken ribs, concussion, but alive, and as she lay in the hospital recovering, she understood. The future showing coffee was malicious, was trap, was designed to create the crashes it showed, to ensure deaths by providing prophecies that drivers would try to prevent, and prevention was participation, was collaboration with fate, was helping crash happen by trying to avoid it. And the truck stop served this coffee deliberately, was killing drivers through prophecy, through visions that created themselves, through futures that manifested because they were seen. She researched the truck stop, found it had high accident rate, found drivers who'd stopped there frequently crashed within days, found correlation between purchasing coffee and experiencing fatal accidents, and she reported it, told authorities, told DOT, told anyone who'd listen, and they investigated, tested the coffee, found nothing unusual, found no precognitive properties, found Margaret was describing impossible phenomena, and they dismissed her, attributed her claims to head trauma, to post-crash stress, to delusion. But Margaret knows the coffee shows futures, knows the truck stop kills through prophecy, knows drivers are still stopping there, still buying coffee, still seeing their crashes, still trying to prevent them, still creating them through prevention. And the deaths continue, the accidents happen, the visions manifest, and the truck stop remains open, remains profitable, remains deadly, serving $2 prophecies to tired drivers who think they're buying caffeine, who don't know they're purchasing their deaths, who don't understand that seeing future is curse, not gift, that knowledge of crashes creates crashes, that the coffee that shows your future is coffee that creates your future, and Margaret never stops at truck stops anymore, never buys coffee from vending machines, never drinks anything that might show visions, might reveal possibilities, might trap her in self-fulfilling prophecy. And she drives carefully, drives blind to her future, drives without knowledge of what's coming. And that ignorance is safety, is protection, is the only defense against coffee that shows crashes, against visions that create themselves, against prophecies that manifest through the attempt to prevent them. And she warns other drivers when she can, tells them avoid Wyoming truck stops, tells them refuse coffee that tastes normal but shows futures, tells them prevention is participation and prophecy is trap. But most don't listen. Most think she's crazy, most stop at the truck stop anyway, buy coffee anyway, see their futures anyway, try to prevent their crashes anyway, and die anyway. Exactly as shown in the coffee, exactly as prophesied by the $2 visions, exactly as ensured by their attempts to avoid what they saw. Forever trapped in paradox, forever creating what they fear, forever dying because they saw death and tried to escape it. The crash at mile marker 394 at 3:47 a.m. or wherever, whenever, however the coffee shows, the future showing coffee that guarantees the future it shows. The prophecy that fulfills itself, the vision that creates reality, the truck stop in Wyoming that kills through caffeine, through foresight, through knowledge that should protect but destroys, forever serving, forever killing, forever showing futures that become real because they were seen. Amen. Story 6. The Way Station That Measures Other Things. The scale at the Tennessee Way Station showed Stanley Morrison's truck weight as 79,400 pounds within legal limits, but the inspector's face went pale reading a second display, a readout Stanley couldn't see, and the inspector said, "Sir, you need to pull over to secondary inspection. There's a problem with your measurement." And Stanley complied, confused, knowing his truck was properly loaded, properly documented, properly legal. And in secondary inspection, 3 more inspectors examined the displays, discussed in whispers, looked at Stanley with expressions mixing fear and pity. And finally, one inspector said, "Mr. Morrison, your truck weighs 79,400 pounds. That's fine. But your life weighs 3 pounds, and that's not fine. That's critical. That's emergency level, and we need to understand why your life has so little weight, why your existence registers as nearly nothing." Stanley didn't understand. "My life weighs what? What does that mean?" The scale measures more than physical mass. It measures existential weight, measures significance, measures how much reality you occupy, how much impact you have, how much your existence matters in the grand calculation. And most people weigh 100 pounds, 200 pounds. Some exceptional people weigh 1,000 pounds, but you weigh 3 pounds, which means you're barely real, barely present, barely existing, and we need to know why. Need to know what's depleted your existential weight, what's reduced your significance to near zero. They showed him the readout. Multiple measurements. Physical weight, 79 to 400 lbs. Driver physical weight, 210 lbs. Driver existential weight, 3.2 lbs. Driver timeline integrity, 12%. Driver reality anchor, critical. And Stanley read the numbers not understanding but feeling dread, feeling like these measurements revealed something fundamental about him, something wrong, something broken. And the 3-pound existential weight was death sentence, was measurement that said Stanley Morrison barely existed, was barely real, was fading from reality, and soon the measurement would hit zero and Stanley would disappear, would cease to exist, would be forgotten by everyone, would be erased from timeline, from memory, from reality itself. How did this happen? Stanley asked. We don't know. Existential weight depletion has many causes: making no impact, forming no connections, living without purpose, being forgotten, making no choices that matter. And over time, people who don't affect reality, who don't change anything, who don't matter to anyone, they lose weight. They become lighter, they fade, and you've faded almost completely, Mr. Morrison. You're 3 pounds away from total erasure, and we don't know how to restore existential weight. Don't know how to increase significance, don't have treatment or solution. We just have measurement, just have ability to tell you you're disappearing. Stanley drove away from the way station, shaken, and he tried to understand his 3-pound existence, tried to identify when he'd started losing weight, when his significance had begun depleting, and he realized it had been gradual. Had been years of living without impact. Years of driving routes without forming connections, years of making no choices that mattered, years of being alone, being isolated, being forgettable, and the isolation had reduced him, had made him lighter, had decreased his reality weight until he was barely present, barely real, barely existing. 3 pounds of significance in body that weighed 210 pounds, massive physical presence with minimal existential presence, heavy body with light soul. He tried to increase his weight, tried to make connections, called his ex-wife, called his brother, called friends from years ago, and they remembered him vaguely, said, Stanley Morrison? Yeah, I think I knew someone by that name. And their memories were faint, were uncertain, were evidence that Stanley had already partially erased, had already faded from their timelines, and calling them didn't restore the connections, didn't increase his weight, just confirmed he was disappearing, was being forgotten, was losing the existential anchors that proved he was real. He tried to make impact, stopped at a homeless shelter, volunteered, helped, served food, talked to people, tried to matter to someone, tried to affect someone's life, and the people he helped barely noticed him, looked through him, forgot him immediately after he left, and Stanley realized his 3-pound existential weight meant he couldn't make impact. Couldn't affect reality, couldn't matter because he didn't exist enough to create effects, and trying to increase weight through helping was impossible when you were already too faded to be perceived, too light to affect anything. He weighed himself at every weigh station, watched the existential weight measurement, and it decreased. 3.2 pounds became 2.8 pounds, became 2.3 pounds, became 1.9 pounds, steady decline, steady fading. And Stanley was disappearing faster now, the decrease accelerating, and he had days, maybe hours, before he hit zero, before he ceased to exist completely. And he didn't know how to stop it, didn't know how to increase weight when weight came from mattering, and he didn't matter. Came from impacting reality, and he couldn't impact reality, came from being remembered, and he was being forgotten. He met another driver with low existential weight. Woman named Price, who weighed 4.1 pounds existentially, who was also fading, and she said, I've been researching this. Existential weight is measured by how many timelines you're essential to. How many possible futures require your presence? How many realities need you to exist for them to function? Most people are essential to dozens of timelines, are needed by family, by friends, by people whose lives would be different without them. And that need creates weight, creates significance, creates reality anchor. But people like us, we're not essential to any timeline. We could disappear and nothing would change. No one would be affected. No futures require our presence. And that lack of necessity is what depletes weight, is what makes us fade. How do we become essential? How do we increase our weight? We need to make ourselves necessary. Need to create situation where timeline requires our presence, where future can't happen without us, where we're crucial to some event, some choice, some outcome. But that's almost impossible for people as faded as us because we can't affect reality enough to make ourselves essential. Can't create impacts when we barely exist. Stanley tried anyway. Tried to make himself essential. Tried to create situations where his presence mattered, where his choices affected outcomes, and he failed repeatedly. His 3-pound existence too faint to create effects, too light to matter, and he watched his weight decrease. 1.9 pounds became 1.4 pounds, became 0.8 pounds, and he was almost gone, was almost erased, was hours from zero, from complete disappearance, from ceasing to exist in any timeline, in any reality, in any memory. He made desperate decision, drove his truck onto a bridge, positioned it across both lanes, blocking traffic, creating situation where his presence mattered, where his choice affected thousands of people, where timeline required his existence to create the blockage. And he stood by his truck, watched traffic back up, watched people affected by his choice, watched reality respond to his presence, and he felt it. His weight increasing, his significance growing, his existential measurement rising because he'd made himself essential to this moment, to this event, had forced reality to acknowledge him, to need him, to be unable to continue without accounting for his presence. Police arrived, demanded he move the truck, and Stanley refused, said he'd move when his weight increased, when he reached healthy existential measurement, when he was real enough to survive, and the police thought he was insane, thought he was having breakdown, and they tried to remove him, but Stanley's weight was increasing. 0.8 pounds became 2.1 pounds, became 4.7 pounds, and with each increment he became more solid, more present, more real, and the police started seeing him clearly, started remembering him, started being unable to ignore him. And Stanley held his position, blocked the bridge, forced timeline to need him, and his weight increased. 4.7 pounds became 9.2 pounds, became 15.8 pounds. And he was becoming essential, becoming significant, becoming real through obstruction, through forcing reality to acknowledge him. But then he stopped, realized what he was doing, realized he was gaining weight by hurting people, by creating problems, by making himself essential through negativity, through obstruction, and that weight was toxic, was built on harm, was significance through damage, and Stanley didn't want that, didn't want to matter because he hurt people, wanted to matter through helping, through connection, through positive impact. But he didn't know how to create positive weight, didn't know how to be essential without being obstacle. He moved the truck, cleared the bridge, apologized to police and drivers, and as he moved, his weight decreased, the significance draining, the essentiality fading, because without the blockage he wasn't needed, wasn't affecting timeline, wasn't creating impacts, and his measurement dropped. 15.8 pounds became 8.3 pounds, became 3.1 pounds. And he was fading again, disappearing again, losing the weight he'd gained. He drove to the way station, asked the inspectors for help, asked if there was treatment, solution, method to increase existential weight permanently, and they said research was ongoing. Said scientists were studying the phenomenon, but current understanding was limited, was mostly measurement without treatment, diagnosis without cure, and people with depleted existential weight usually just faded, just disappeared, just ceased to exist when measurement hit zero. and there were no confirmed cases of recovery, no instances of weight restoration, just steady decline, steady fading, steady erasure. Stanley's weight hit zero at a truck stop in Kentucky 3 days after the bridge incident. He felt it happen, felt himself cease being essential to any timeline, felt reality release him, felt all memories of him fade from all minds, felt his existence erase itself retroactively. And he sat in his truck cab disappearing, watching his hands become transparent, watching his body fade, watching the world forget him completely. And his last thought was regret, was wishing he'd made different choices, had formed different connections, had mattered to someone, had created enough impact to generate existential weight, to anchor himself in reality, to be essential to some timeline, to some person, to some outcome, but he hadn't. He'd lived without impact. And now he was disappearing, was being erased, was ceasing to exist, and there was no one to mourn him because no one remembered him, and there was no record of him because records faded when existential weight hit zero, and Stanley Morrison vanished completely, erased from reality, forgotten by everyone. Measurement zero, significance zero, impact zero, existence zero, gone. And the way station in Tennessee continues measuring, continues displaying existential weight, continues warning drivers whose measurements are low, whose reality anchors are weak, whose timelines don't need them, and some drivers increase their weight. Some make themselves essential, but most fade like Stanley. Most disappear like Stanley. Most hit zero and erase like Stanley, and the measurements continue. The warnings continue. The scale that measures more than physical weight continues operating. Continues revealing who matters and who doesn't, who exists significantly and who exists barely, who's essential and who's disappearing, forever weighing, forever measuring, forever displaying the existential weight that determines whether you're real or fading, whether you matter or disappear, whether you exist or never existed at all. Story 7. The load that gets heavier as you drive. The manifest listed 42,000 pounds when Jackson Hayes picked up the load in Newark, standard freight, electronics and machinery, normal cargo, and the truck handled normally for the first 100 miles, but around mile marker 215 on I-80. West Jackson felt the weight increase, felt the trailer pulling harder, felt the load settle heavier, and he checked his mirrors expecting to see the trailer sagging, but everything looked normal, and he drove on. And at mile marker 340 the weight had increased noticeably, the truck struggling on hills, braking slower, handling like it was overloaded, and Jackson pulled into a weigh station, rolled across the scale, and the readout showed 63,000 pounds, 21,000 pounds more than his manifest, more than his pickup weight. And the load was growing, was gaining mass, was somehow adding weight during transit, and Jackson had driven 7 hours and gained 21,000 pounds and didn't know how, didn't know why. Didn't know what he was actually hauling in that sealed trailer. What was multiplying or expanding or accumulating mass as he traveled west. He called his dispatcher. The load is getting heavier, started at 42,000, now showing 63,000, and I've added nothing. Haven't picked up anything. The load is generating weight somehow. That's impossible. Loads don't gain weight. You must have been overloaded at pickup. I wasn't overloaded. The pickup scale showed 42,000. Something's happening during transit. Something's adding mass. Jackson, loads don't add mass. Check your scale, check your sensors. Something's malfunctioning. Jackson hung up, frustrated, and he continued driving, watching his truck's handling deteriorate, feeling the weight increase with each mile, and at mile marker 475 he weighed again, 81,000 pounds, 39,000 pounds over pickup weight, and the load had nearly doubled, and Jackson's truck wasn't rated for this weight, wasn't built to haul 81,000 pounds, and the brakes were failing, the tires were straining, the suspension was compressing, and he was driving a vehicle that was overloaded beyond safety limits, beyond physical capacity. and the weight kept increasing, kept growing with each mile he drove west. He tried to open the trailer, need to see the cargo to understand what was multiplying, and the seal broke with difficulty. The doors resisted, and when Jackson finally got them open, he saw the cargo had changed. The electronics and machinery were gone, replaced by stone, by rock, by mineral deposits, and the trailer was filling with stone from bottom up, accumulating rock, generating geology. And Jackson realized the load wasn't electronics, had never been electronics, had been something else disguised as electronics, and that something was creating stone, was manifesting rock from nothing, was adding geological mass with each mile traveled, and the process was accelerating, was generating stone faster as the truck moved west, and Jackson was hauling a trailer that was becoming mountain, that was filling with rock, that would eventually exceed any weight his truck could handle. He tried to dump the load, found an empty lot, backed in, opened the trailer doors fully, tried to let the stone pour out, but the rock wouldn't move, was solid, was single continuous mass filling the trailer completely. And Jackson couldn't dump it, couldn't lighten the load, could only watch the weight increase, watch the stone grow, watch his trailer fill from bottom to top with rock that materialized from nothing. At mile marker 620, the weight was 100,000 pounds. Jackson's truck was groaning, frame bending, axles failing, and he couldn't continue, couldn't haul this weight, had to stop, had to abandon the load, but when he tried to unhitch, the fifth wheel wouldn't release, was locked by weight, by pressure, by the mass of stone crushing down on the coupling, and Jackson was trapped, was coupled to trailer full of stone that kept growing, kept gaining weight, kept pulling his truck down, and he couldn't escape, couldn't leave, could only drive or stop, and stopping meant being crushed when the weight finally exceeded structural limits, meant being destroyed when the trailer collapsed under its own mass, meant dying beneath geological load that shouldn't exist, that was manifesting from nothing, that was filling his trailer with stone mile by mile. He drove, had no choice, had to keep moving, had to continue west, and the weight kept increasing. 100,000 pounds became 120,000, became 150,000. And Jackson's truck was failing catastrophically, tires blowing, suspension breaking, frame cracking, and he was driving a vehicle that was destroying itself, that couldn't handle the load, that was being crushed by cargo that kept multiplying, kept growing, kept adding mass with each mile. And Jackson didn't know what would happen when the weight exceeded the truck's absolute limits, whether the vehicle would collapse, whether the trailer would break free, whether the stone would crush him. He researched while driving, dangerous one-handed phone use, and he found references to geological cargo, to loads that manifested stone during transit, to ancient shipping methods where merchants moved rock by creating it in motion, generating it during travel, and the process required westward movement, required traveling toward setting sun, and the stone accumulated proportional to distance traveled, proportional to sunset-ward progress, and Jackson was hauling geological cargo, was carrying load that created itself through motion, that grew through travel, that added mass mile by mile, and the final weight would be determined by total distance, by how far west he drove before reaching destination. His destination was Sacramento, California. Jackson calculated the distance, another 800 miles, and he calculated the weight accumulation, approximately 2 pounds per mile based on current rate. And that meant adding another 1,600 pounds, reaching total weight around 167,000 pounds by the time he reached Sacramento. Weight that would destroy his truck long before arrival. Weight that would kill him through vehicle failure, through brake failure, through jackknife or rollover or collapse. He tried to deliver early, looked for facilities in Nebraska, Wyoming, anywhere between his position and Sacramento, hoping to dump the load before reaching full weight, before the stone crushed his truck, and he found nothing. No receivers, no facilities that accepted geological cargo, and his manifest specified Sacramento, specified exact address, and delivering anywhere else was contract violation, was theft, was crime. At mile marker 780, the weight was 135,000 pounds. Jackson's truck was operating on failing components, emergency mode systems, and drivers around him were giving him wide berth, were recognizing his vehicle was dangerous, was unstable, was heavily overloaded, and Jackson received CB warnings. Kenworth on I-80, you're riding low, check your weight, you look overloaded, and Jackson couldn't respond, couldn't explain he was hauling stone that manifested from nothing, that his load doubled during transit, that he was being crushed by geological cargo because explanations sounded insane, sounded like breakdown, sounded like driver who'd lost his mind. The stone broke through. At mile marker 850, weight 148,000 pounds, the trailer floor failed. The stone broke through the bottom, dragged on the highway, created sparks and smoke, and Jackson was pulling trailer that was disintegrating, that couldn't contain the weight, that was shedding fragments of itself, and behind him the highway was damaged, was scarred by rock dragging across asphalt, and he was creating geological trail, was leaving stone behind as the load was too heavy to remain contained, and the fragments he shed reduced his weight slightly, gave him brief relief. But the stone continued generating, continued filling the trailer, continued adding mass faster than it fell out, and Jackson was still gaining weight, still approaching catastrophic failure. He considered crashing, considered deliberately wrecking, destroying the truck and trailer, stopping the westward motion, ending the weight accumulation through termination of travel. And death seemed preferable to continuing this nightmare, to driving another 600 miles while stone crushed his vehicle. But Jackson couldn't do it, couldn't force himself to crash, couldn't choose death, and he kept driving, kept hauling geological cargo towards Sacramento, kept moving west through accumulating mass. At mile marker 920, Utah border, weight 159,000 pounds, Jackson's trailer collapsed completely. The frame broke, the structure failed, the stone was too heavy and the trailer broke apart, dumped its cargo onto the highway. Scattered rock across I-80, and Jackson's truck was suddenly free, was unburdened, and he felt the lightness, felt the relief, felt the weight disappear. But then he looked in his mirrors and saw the stone reforming, saw the rock gathering itself, flowing back together, and a new trailer materialized, manifested from nothing. Replaced the broken trailer coupled to Jackson's fifth wheel automatically, and the stone loaded itself into the new trailer, and Jackson was still hauling geological cargo, still coupled to load that couldn't be destroyed, couldn't be dumped, couldn't be escaped, and the weight was back, was 159,000 pounds again, and the new trailer was stronger, was reinforced, was designed to handle the weight. And Jackson understood the cargo was self-protecting, was ensuring its own delivery, was creating whatever vehicles it needed to reach Sacramento. He gave up fighting, accepted he was vehicle for geological cargo, accepted the stone controlled the situation, accepted he'd haul this load to Sacramento or die trying. And he drove, and the weight increased. 159,000 became 170,000, became 190,000. And the manifestation accelerated. The stone generated faster, and Jackson realized the cargo was eager, was approaching its destination, was multiplying rapidly because it was almost home, almost where it wanted to be, and the weight became irrelevant. The truck handled the load effortlessly because the cargo was supporting itself, was manipulating physics to ensure its own delivery, and Jackson was just steering, was just navigating, was just pilot for geological cargo that controlled everything else. He reached Sacramento. The weight was 237,000 pounds. Jackson's manifest showed delivery address in foothills outside the city, quarry or mine, and when he arrived, the facility was ancient, was stone structure that looked pre-human, and workers or things that looked like workers unloaded the stone, moved it carefully, reverently. And Jackson watched rock from his trailer being added to structure, being incorporated into architecture, and he understood the geological cargo was building material, was component of something vast, something ancient. something that had been under construction for millennia, and trucks like his had been hauling stone for centuries, delivering rock that manifested during westward travel, contributing to structure that was growing stone by stone, load by load, and Jackson had delivered another 200,000 pounds, had added his contribution to whatever was being built in Sacramento foothills. The workers paid him. Standard delivery payment, and they said, "Thank you for your service. The structure appreciates your contribution. You may haul geological cargo again if you're chosen. The stone will find you." Jackson drove away. Empty trailer, light truck, normal handling. But he knew he'd be chosen again, knew the geological cargo would find him, knew he'd haul stone that manifested from nothing, that grew during westward travel, that added weight mile by mile, and he'd deliver to Sacramento again, would contribute to structure again, would be vehicle for stone that built itself, that created itself through motion, that accumulated mass through travel toward setting sun. And the structure in Sacramento foothills was growing, stone by stone, load by load, and someday it would be complete, would finish whatever architecture it was becoming, and then what? Then the stone would stop manifesting, stop needing haulers, stop growing, or would it continue forever? Would it keep building? Would trucks keep hauling geological cargo west forever, adding to structure that grew infinitely, that never completed, that consumed stone as fast as trucks could deliver it? Forever manifesting, forever growing, forever building through geological cargo that gained weight as you drove. 2 pounds per mile, 40,000 pounds to 200,000 pounds, pickup to delivery, empty trailer to trailer full of stone, and the structure waited in Sacramento. Always waited, always needed more stone, always chose drivers to haul cargo that created itself, that grew itself, that built itself through westward motion, through sunset-ward travel, through trucks that started light and ended crushed, through drivers like Jackson Hayes who hauled stone from nothing to Sacramento, from manifestation to architecture, from quantum possibility to geological reality, forever heavier, forever west, forever building. Amen.